Solomon is among the most iconic kings in history, one of the most prosperous rulers of all time, and one of the richest men the world has ever seen. In the Bible, he is highlighted not only for being the successor of his father, King David, on the throne of Israel, but also for his unusual wisdom and extraordinary works, the main one being the first temple in Jerusalem. To give you an idea, although Solomon is not mentioned in the biblical text until the last days of David are recorded, after that, his name appears about 300 times, just in the Old Testament, and at least 12 times in the New Testament. However, Solomon's name is also mentioned in other non-biblical writings, and is involved in Jewish legends that even link him to a series of mystical and even obscure practices, such as, for example, a supposed control over demons. But in this video, you will learn the true story of Solomon according to the Bible. Solomon was the son of David and Bathsheba, who had been the wife of Uriah. Therefore, Solomon was born while David was already reigning from Jerusalem. He is also referred to in the Bible by the name Jedediah, which means beloved of the Lord. King Solomon ruled over Israel for about 40 years, approximately from 971 to 931 BC, 971 and 931 BC. There is practically no information about Solomon's early years, youth. But considering the biblical information about David's family life, we can establish a parameter about the kind of environment in which Solomon grew up. We know that David had several wives, and this obviously resulted in many problems among his wives and children, who were involved in various intrigues, usually in pursuit of prestige and power. Indeed, Solomon himself appears in the biblical story in a context of great tension within the royal family, amid a struggle for the throne of Israel, as King David was old and weakened. But before that, Absalom, who was Solomon's half-brother, had already tried to usurp their father's throne, but he was unsuccessful. However, sometime later, the oldest surviving son of David, named Adonijah, tried to repeat Absalom's move by proclaiming himself king over Israel. Adonijah even managed to gain the support of Joab, David's former general, and the priest Abiathar, and he tried in every way to take his father's throne, even holding a coronation celebration. So, when they learned of Adonijah's plan, Bathsheba, the prophet Nathan, the priest Zadok, and other allies worked to remind David of the unfulfilled promise regarding Solomon that he would be his successor. Thus, David gave orders regarding Solomon's ascension to the throne, and he was crowned king of Israel, being anointed by Zadok. Probably, when he was crowned, King Solomon was no more than 8 long, lasting 4 decades of rule. But scholars debate whether his reign occurred approximately between 971 and 931 BC, or between 960 and 920 BC, the first possibility being the most likely, before Christ, or between 960 and 920 BC, with the first possibility being the most likely. Right after David's death, King Solomon followed his father's instructions and acted accordingly to solidify his position as king and dismantle any opposition. So, he took care to order the deaths of Adonijah and Joab, and the banishment of Abiathar, and then he began to reign without internal opposition. King Solomon inherited from David a vast territory, covering approximately 128,000 square kilometers. During his reign, Solomon greatly improved the living conditions in Israel. He replaced the old tribal divisions with a division of his territory into 12 administrative districts, each of which had an official appointed by the king. These districts were responsible for providing sustenance for the court throughout the year, with each district being in charge of supplying for 1 month. The list of daily provisions was quite burdensome, and according to the record in the first book of Kings, chapter 4, it included 9,000 kilos of flour, both fine and common flour, 30 oxen, both fattened and raised on common pasture, 100 sheep and rams, as well as deer, gazelles, roebucks, well-treated birds, which served as delicacies at the table, and many people think that this amount is fanciful. However, these people forget that this food was meant for the entire court of Israel at its peak, which likely included all the officials, the officers, and King Solomon's extended family. Many scholars believe that this amount likely fed over 12,000 people every day. King Solomon's court was quite complete and organized, and his government aides were called princes. And in the military realm, King Solomon also made significant improvements. He introduced war chariots and cavalry into his army. He also provided new roads, established border fortresses to guard the trade routes. Speaking of trade, commercial activity was the strong point of Solomon's reign. He controlled trade routes and organized strategic points of operation that brought him a lot of revenue, so much so that silver became as common in his kingdom as stone and cedar, allowing him to live in a splendor of wealth never seen before in Israel. In addition, he was a great diplomat, and throughout his reign, Israel rarely had to worry about any foreign military threats. The first significant trade agreement of Solomon was with Hiram, king of Tyre, in which he paid, annually, something equivalent to 2,000 tons of wheat and 400,000 liters of pure olive oil in exchange for timber and marble for his constructions. King Solomon also made a deal with merchants from Egypt for the trade of horses and chariots, and in turn, exported them to the Hittites and Syrians, making, of course, a good profit. And the commercial activity that brought the most profit to King Solomon was his maritime trade, where his ships sailed through the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea in the Indian Ocean, reaching Ophir. And these voyages could last 2-3 years. When considering the annual revenue from his trade strategies, the fees he collected from the traffic of goods, and the taxes paid by the population across all the territory he controlled, the estimated sum of wealth reaches an exceptional level, placing King Solomon as one of the richest men in all of human history. All the constructions carried out during King Solomon's reign, the temple in Jerusalem was certainly the most important of them. According to God's own promise, King Solomon carried out his father's project to build a temple to house the Ark of the Covenant. And to obtain the necessary labor, King Solomon resorted to forced labor, especially from Canaanite peoples, subjugated by Israel. However, the number of Canaanite workers was insufficient to meet his plans. So, he recruited Israelites for this task, also forcing them into a type of forced labor. Obviously, this measure was quite unpopular, fact that was evident in the episode of the death of Adoniram Mo, the superintendent of the labor groups. The temple built by Solomon was located on Mount Moriah, place where King David had built an altar to the Lord, and before that, probably where Abraham had gone up with Isaac to sacrifice him. But despite David having collected materials for the construction of the temple, it was only in the 4th year of Solomon's reign that it began to be built. And even though it may seem like a building with modest dimensions by today's standards, the temple building represented a large undertaking at the time, constructed with the most valuable materials, including tons of gold and fine woods. When he completed the construction of the temple in the 11th year of his reign, King Solomon planned a grand celebration where many sacrifices were offered at the dedication of the building. And among the other buildings constructed by King Solomon in Israel, we can highlight the House of the Forest of Lebanon, which was 50 meters long, 25 meters wide, and 15 meters high, with a portico of columns measuring 25 by 15 meters, a hall for his throne where he held judgments, a house for the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt, who was one of his wives, which had an impressive grandeur. And Solomon's own residence must have been a remarkable construction, a considerable construction, where he housed 700 wives and 300 concubines, along with the necessary servants. In addition, Solomon also built Milo, a huge fortress to protect the temple. King Solomon became known for his wisdom. In the Bible, we read about the record of the dream that King Solomon had, where the Lord appeared to him and asked what he desired the most. Solomon could have asked for wealth or longevity or honor. However, the young king asked for wisdom. He asked for an understanding heart so he could wisely govern his people. And one of the biblical episodes that most highlights King Solomon's wisdom is the one where two mothers came before him, each claiming to be the mother of a single newborn. The case was quite difficult as there were no witnesses. But with great wisdom, King Solomon proposed that the boy be divided into two parts to solve the problem. And faced with the possibility of her son's death, the true mother preferred to give the boy to the impostor woman, which led Solomon to judge the case impeccably. The wisdom of King Solomon can also be seen in all the literature he produced. Solomon composed thousands of proverbs and songs, and the depth of his proverbs is also impressive. So much so that the Bible reports that he spoke about trees, animals, birds, reptiles, and fish. In addition to the biblical accounts, many legends and documents from antiquity refer to Solomon's spectacular wisdom. And among the books of the Bible, large part of the book of Proverbs is attributed to Solomon, as well as Ecclesiastes, possibly the book of Song of Songs, and at least Psalms 72 and 127. The Bible also says that Solomon's wisdom was so impressive that people from all nations and all the kings of the earth came to hear his wisdom. And one of those visits was made by the Queen of Sheba, who came from the ends of the earth to hear King Solomon's wisdom in person. The Queen of Sheba asked Solomon many questions and riddles, and the king answered all her inquiries intelligently, leaving her completely impressed. At that time, Queen of Sheba gifted Solomon with many presents, including over 4 tons of gold. Despite all the wisdom he had, King Solomon made choices that brought him great problems. For example, Solomon subjected the people to forced labor. His international trade practices somehow allowed idolatry to enter among the Israelites through contact with other peoples. He imposed a heavy tax burden that weighed down the Israelites. And there was also his intense polygamy, which was the main way through which false gods began to be recognized in Hebrew territory. In fact, Solomon himself was influenced by his many foreign wives, and in his old age, practiced mixed worship, following other gods. And speaking of Solomon's married life, it seems that marriage was part of his political maneuvers. In other words, it seems that Solomon used his marriages to secure advantageous international agreements, although it is also true that the biblical text records that Solomon loved his wives, indicating that his relationships were not solely aimed at strategic advantages. In any case, Solomon reached the impressive number of 700 wives, in addition to 300 concubines. He was the Israelite ruler who most disregarded the biblical command that a king in Israel should not have many wives, so that his heart would not turn away from the Lord. Among King Solomon's wives was the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt, and at the time of this union, Solomon received the city of Gezer as a dowry. Some Arab, Jewish, and Ethiopian traditions suggest that Solomon also had a romantic relationship with the Queen of Sheba, from which a son was supposedly born, allegedly Menelik I, the founder of the Ethiopian royal house. However, the Bible does not report anything about this. Now Solomon's heir, Rehoboam, was born from his marriage to Naamah, a woman. Reconsidering the period of Solomon's reign, which lasted 40 years, and the age of his son Rehoboam when he succeeded him, at 41 years old, we can conclude that Solomon's relationship with Naamah began before his reign. For this reason, many scholars believe that Naamah may have been Solomon's first wife. But the serious sin of King Solomon, when he defied the worship of God in Israel by starting to follow other gods to please his foreign wives, could not go unpunished. The Bible says that God was angry with Solomon. The truth is that the king most known for his wisdom and unimaginable wealth also experienced decline and subsequent divine disapproval, because, ironically, he was not wise with the things of God and disregarded his commandments. However, in his mercy and love for David, God suspended his total judgment during Solomon's lifetime and did not take the kingdom from him. However, even with the postponement of divine judgment during his life, Solomon faced threats from enemies that God raised up to be instruments of judgment in his kingdom, such as Hadad the Edomite, Rezon the Aramean, and Jeroboam. Among these three opponents, Jeroboam stands out the most in the biblical text. He was a strong and hard-working leader who rebelled against King Solomon's policies, and during Rehoboam's reign, he divided the kingdom of Israel and became the king of the northern tribes. Therefore, after Solomon's death, divine punishment was indeed poured out on his house, and the glorious unified kingdom of Israel was taken away from his son. The Bible does not provide details about how Solomon died. What is known is that he ended his life in a melancholic way, leaving a worn-out kingdom on the verge of collapse. But, without a doubt, he made very important contributions to Israel. Solomon was the king who built the Lord's temple. He was the king who consolidated Israel on the international stage of his time, and he was the main exponent of Hebrew wisdom literature. As for the many extra biblical stories about Solomon, there is no evidence that they are true. Yes, in fact, the Bible itself mentions the existence of records about Solomon. In fact, some of these records, such as the one titled The Book of the History of Solomon, served as sources for the biblical writer of the books of 1 Kings and 2 Kings. However, these materials have been lost, meaning they no longer exist. What remains today are just legends and fanciful writings, mainly produced by followers of a more mystical branch of later Judaism. In these legends, Solomon is often portrayed as someone involved with magic, capable of controlling demons, and even talking to animals. But these accounts are generally based on pseudepigraphal writings of unknown authorship that were likely produced in the medieval period. However, unfortunately, many uninformed people prefer to believe in the truth of these false works and reject what is actually recorded in the biblical text, which, whether people like it or not, is the most well-documented work in history. In fact, it's common for some people to say that the true story of Solomon was hidden from the Bible. But this, of course, makes no sense at all, because these mystical stories about Solomon emerged long after the biblical text of the Old Testament was written. As for archaeology, most archaeologists agree on the historicity of Solomon, although there is much debate about the extent and characteristics of his kingdom. But recent archaeological finds have increasingly contributed to the understanding of the period of the Israelite monarchy. Although excavations in the area where the temple was located, which may be the most important for possible discoveries from Solomon's time, are always very problematic due to political and religious issues. So, what we can really know reliably about who Solomon was is what is recorded in the Bible. And the most important thing in all of this is to understand that all the glory and splendor of Solomon's kingdom only foreshadowed the eternal kingdom of the Messiah, so that Psalm 72, attributed to Solomon, uses hyperbolic language to refer both to the human king and to proclaim the divine king who is Christ,